In 2024, something unusual happened in African politics. In Botswana, a ruling party that had governed for over 60 years peacefully lost power and accepted the results. In Ghana, the incumbent candidates conceded defeat even before the final results were announced. And in countries like Kenya, Malawi, courts intervened to overturn and stabilize contested elections.
My fellow Botswana, I stand before you this morning humbled but proud. At the end of my first term as president, I wish to congratulate the opposition.
On the surface, this looks like democratic progress, but at the same time, something else was happening. Across the continent, military coups have returned. Since 2020, there have been 13 coup attempts, 8 successful ones. In countries like Benin, once considered democratic success stories, governments have begun restricting opposition, manipulating electoral law, and tightening control over the media. So it's no longer a democracy, but more of an autocracy. And when researchers measured democracy across the continent, the results aren't even striking anymore, to be honest. According to Varieties of Democracy project, today Africa today has roughly the same number of electoral democracies as it did 20 years ago. So basically, democracy is having a recession. Out of 46 countries, only 7 remain consistently democratic, 27 remained autocratic, and several have moved backwards. How can elections expand while democratic outcomes stagnate? How can some countries stabilize while others collapse? To answer that, we need to move beyond simple questions. Not is there democracy in Africa, but what kind of systems are these democracies operating within? Some autocracies, some dictatorships, bureaucracies, you name it. Because the data suggests something deeper. This is not a story of success or failure, it's a story of structure, incentives, and constraints actually happening here. Let's dive into it. One specific source I would like to cite for the specific claims I just made would be this. The data used here comes from sources like the Brookings Institution and the Varieties of Democracy project, both of which track long-term political trends across African states. So instead of focusing on opinions, we're looking at measurable patterns over time. I'll be dropping the link to the book in the description. So I'll be referencing this source in front of me. So now let's dive into this. To understand what's driving the instability, we need to look beyond elections and focus on what's happening when democratic systems fail to deliver. In recent years, Africa has seen a sharp resurgence of military coups. Between 2020 and 2022 alone, there were 6 successful coups, if not 8, alongside multiple failed attempts, marking a dramatic increase compared to previous decades. But this isn't random. It's geographically concentrated, especially in the Sahel region, now often described as a coup belt, if you've seen the images online. And then shift to why are we here and why now? Let's take our time to think about it. One explanation is performance. In many cases, coups emerge not from absence of democracy, but from disalignment with how democracy is functioning. According to the political risk analysis, repeated military takeovers are often linked to weaker governance, corruption among political elites, and the failure of the governments to deliver economic or security outcomes. In other words, the problem isn't just whether elections exist, it's whether governments actually govern. And in regions like the Sahel, that challenge becomes even more severe. Due to jihadist insurgencies, you name it. Many of these states face persistent insurgencies, extremists with groups linked to Al Qaeda and ISIS operating across borders, basically moving between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, and all the way around. In that context, the military often positions itself not as a threat, but as a savior for the state, so as the last remaining institution capable of enforcing order on the population. But coups don't just reshape politics, they reshape economies. Countries experiencing military takeovers often face declining investor confidence, credit downgrades, and reduced access to global and financial markets. In practical terms, this means that higher borrowing costs, less foreign investment, and slower economic growth. A good example would be how foreign aid has been cut off to Burkina Faso and other military juntas in the AES now. And the effects don't stay contained within one country, they usually spread across the borders. For instance, we can reference Gamal Abdel Nasser from the 1960s. After the coup, the Free Officers' coup in Egypt, They began to export these ideologies to fellow Arab states, like in Egypt, like in Libya with Gaddafi, and then Iraq with Qussein, then Arif, and then we had Syria. So many examples. Researchers describe the phenomenon known as coup contagion, where one successful military takeover increases the likelihood of others across the region. Each coup lowers the perceived cost of seizing power, gradually normalizing military intervention as a political strategy. At the same time, these political shifts are shaping global alignments. Military led governments often reconfigure their external partnerships, sometimes turning away from traditional Western allies and towards alternative security arrangements, like Burkina Faso turning away from France and then moving towards Russia and the Wagner Group. In countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, new security partnerships have emerged alongside broader shifts in geopolitical influence. Let's take our time if you think more deeper, because I'm really enjoying this discussion, even though I'm the only one talking in this video. So, what we're seeing isn't just instability, it's a feedback loop. Weak governance leads to coups, weaken economic performance, and weaker economies make stable democratic governance even harder to sustain. And now, which raises a deeper question. If both democratic governments and military regimes struggle under the same conditions, then the issue may not be the system itself, but the structures those systems are operating within. Now, I want you to pause the video and take your time to think about everything I just said, because I think you'll be able to pick up something you could have in a discussion with somebody about African politics. If military coups are so destabilizing, why do they often receive public support? In several cases, military takeovers are not just imposed from above, they emerge in environments where civilian governments have already lost legitimacy and trust of the people. Like when Nasser took over Egypt and overthrew the monarch, because the monarch had lost the trust and support of the people, and that's the reason why Nasser and the military junta that came with him were able to rally up large public support. We could even use Burm Traore in Burkina Faso. He got large public support and reception after he overthrew the government. The core explanation would be across many countries experiencing coups, the underlying conditions are similar: weak governance, economic hardship, and persistent insecurity. In these contexts, coups are often framed as a rejection aren't not often framed as a rejection of democracy itself, but as a reaction to governments perceived as corrupt, ineffective, or unable to deliver basic outcomes. In other words, support for coups is often less about ideology and more about performance, because people want economic stability. People want to feel safe. And that's where the support for these military coups comes from. Economic conditions play a central role, actually. In many cases, rising poverty, unemployment, and inflation creates widespread dissatisfaction, especially with democratic governments who fail to translate political participation into martial improvements. If you're from Africa, this can be seen all over Africa. There's several examples of this in Nigeria, Cameroon, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, with the civilian governments and the dissatisfaction we have with them because of the lack of them keeping their promises and actually improving the day-to-day life of the average African. This creates a gap between the promise of democracy and the lived reality of citizens. Military leaders often step into this gap with a clear narrative: restore order, fight corruption, and revive the economy. But empirical evidence suggests a different outcome. On average, countries that experience military coups see sharp economic declines, even though in some cases they do see an economic upward trajectory, but that's usually short term. Long term, it's usually not sustainable because soldiers aren't economists or politicians. With GDP growth falling significantly in coup years and recovery often remaining weak in the long term. So there's a contradiction at the center of this dynamic. Coups gain support because governments fail to deliver, but coups themselves often make these conditions worse for the people. This suggests that the public support for military interventions isn't necessary or irrational. It reflects a breakdown in the relationship between citizens and the state. When democratic systems fail to provide security, economic stability, or basic services, legitimacy shifts away from institutions and towards any actor that promises immediate change. That's what brings us to the deeper issue. The deeper issue would be if both democratic governments and military regimes struggle to produce stability and stable outcomes, then the problem may not be who is in power, but actually the underlying structure of the state itself. Elite capture, bureaucracies, even the deep state. So what's your take? Drop it in the comments so we can dive deeper. Remember to subscribe. I'll be dropping more long-form videos like this. One explanation is performance. In many cases, coups emerge not from absence of democracy, but from disalignment with how democracy is functioning. According to the political risk analysis, repeated military takeovers are often linked to weaker governance, corruption among political elites, and the failure of the governments to deliver economic or security outcomes. The coup can then appear incorrectly but understandably as a reset point where economic conditions might improve faster under new authority. In some cases, post-coup periods involve visible anti-corruption drives or restructuring of elite networks. Even if these changes are not institutionalized, they can temporarily shift perception. Fairness, especially in systems where corruption is widely rampant and in the civilian government and elites. The very factor that generates short-term support, speed, centralization, forceful decision-making, are the same factors that tend to weaken long-term institutional development. Economic consequences such as reduced investments, weaker financial credibility, and institutional instability do not fully appear immediately. This is more in the long term. They accumulate over time, which means that public perception and long-term economic reality often diverge in the early phase after the coup. So the issue is not simply that people support coups, it's that political systems sometimes create a mismatch between short-term visible control and long-term structural performance. And then that mismatch persists across both democratic and military systems. It reveals something deeper than the regime type. It reveals that the core constraint in many cases is not political choice, but the limited capacity of institutions to convert authority into sustained development. So I'll be dropping a longer form video on a topic on Africa, and do to be surprised. So remember to subscribe for that video. Hope you enjoyed this and hope you got new insights into Africa and its relation with democracy. Thank you.